And a hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 127 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this Friday, late afternoon into early evening in New York. If you're catching this episode on the YouTube channel or enjoying the content, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, share, comment, turn on those notifications. Or if you're checking out this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. So today will be the 8th in our continuing series of, my opinion, the most underrated film performances. And we're going to be spotlighting a movie and performance which is now incredibly almost a quarter of a century old. That would be Milos Forman's 1999 biopic, biographical film about a real-life person, Man on the Moon, starring Jim Carrey as the real-life, often called a comedian, but he liked to refer to himself as a song and dance man, the first performance artist, at least to gain wide exposure, Great Neck, New York native Andy Kaufman. And Jim's performance is not just one performance in this film. He plays more or less 3 characters. He plays the real-life Andy Kaufman, who was, basically a Great Neck kid who made it good, made it big. He plays Andy Kaufman's alter ego, a performance outlet of his, a kind of obnoxious lounge singer who went by Tony Clifton and didn't really look much like Andy Kaufman. But then he also plays Andy Kaufman when he was performing, and nobody knew whether it was real or whether he was fucking around. There are 2 Andys in the movie, and there's this renegade wild card, Tony Clifton. And Jim Carrey figures out how to delineate between the 3 with a look, with a gesture, with an insult. It is for me, top 10 greatest cinema performance with what he's able to do. And many people just don't like this movie. And the criticism at the time when it was released, and this, as I always say, this is something you can Google. You can find the contemporary reviews, not just people like myself talking about it now. They saw the movie as a kind of unsequenced greatest hits of Andy Kaufman's brief but illustrious career as an entertainer. He did stand up. He did TV. He was on the show Taxi. And he made movies. He wasn't really that successful as a film actor, although there were people who would argue that, well, he just didn't have enough time to kind of get it going. But I mean, the movie that he did with Bernadette Peters called Heart Beeps, that's a movie that they could probably remake and might be interesting. But he didn't really make that many movies. He didn't have that big of an opportunity to show his stuff on the big screen. But what Jim Carrey does in this film is he engages in almost a full-on channeling of the spirit of the real Andy Kaufman, who had been gone for close to 15 years. Sorry, spoilers. Andy Kaufman passed 4 decades ago. Jim Carrey, who was always a fan of Andy Kaufman growing up, people who worked on this movie, some people had bad experiences because Jim was so deep in character, he was disruptive. The famous wrestler Jerry Lawler, looking back, wishes that it had been a different time because he was a Jim Carrey fan, just as a guy going to the movies, and he wanted to get along with him, but Jim Carrey was being so disruptive as Andy Kaufman in this antagonistic manner. He was acting as if a phony wrestling feud was real as they were filming the movie. And Lawler had a couple of moments. You just want to take this fucking guy and stuff his head into a locker and leave him there. Carrey was so deep into doing what he was doing creatively that he frustrated a lot of people. And reports were coming out of the set at the time, this movie's not going to work. We may not be able to finish it. We don't know which Jim Carrey is coming to the set on a given day. He's just completely out of his mind. He's off his rocker. Now, there was a lot of chatter of that back in 98-ish when the movie was being made. But then there was counter arguments. This is all to promote the movie. This is bullshit. Jim is a professional. He's going about his business. He's doing the best he can. It's great. We're looking for. So nobody really knew for sure. I'm not interested in the extraneous stuff, just the story that we're told. And the movie opens right away with an unbelievable fourth wall break where Andy Kaufman, well, Jim Carrey as Andy Kaufman, more or less in one of the characters that he was famous for during his kind of solo career, if you want to say stand-up, although he always said, I'm a song and dance man. He did like weird nursery rhymes. He did a lot of shit that nobody had tried. And you would say, well, there's a reason why they didn't try it. It's not funny. But he found the art. The real Andy Kaufman found the humor and the art in things which had previously not been considered funny. He was an insult comic without really being an insult comic. The movie opens with this fourth wall break where it's supposed to be the real Andy Kaufman telling us, this movie's not that good. You're not going to like it. They've taken so much. They've mixed up so many important parts of my life and rearranged it for dramatic purposes. And he goes into all this stuff. So right away, they're breaking the rules of the biographical film. Because most biopics, to one extent or another, are going to have fictitious elements. Not long after Man on the Moon, you had A Beautiful Mind, which was the Ron Howard film starring Russell Crowe as, the famous mathematician John Nash. And although technically that is a biographical film and a true story, yeah, a huge chunk of that movie did not happen the way it was portrayed, and or there were events told out of sequence, and or the real John Nash did not get to give a speech when he, spoiler alert, won the Nobel Prize. So Milos Forman, who had directed One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and what I believe to be his, well, after Man on the Moon, his masterpiece, Amadeus, you know you're in the hands of a master filmmaker. The Milos Forman, at his peak, he made movies where every single scene is a home run. Amadeus, whether the director's cut or the theatrical version, they're both very long and they're both spectacular. There is not a wasted frame in his work, not a wasted performance, a wasted line reading by the notorious Jeffrey Jones in Amadeus as Emperor Joseph. Well, there it is. There it is. There it is. Man on the Moon does have a bit of an episodic structure where you're moving from what turns out to be one major event in Andy Kaufman's life until the end of his life. That's true. I don't see that as a criticism. I see that as stylistic choice and really the only way that this movie was going to work. The only way we were going to really get any idea about the real Andy Kaufman. Because the real Andy Kaufman remained a mystery even to those who knew him best. And that's kind of part of the point, is that so many people didn't know when it was part of the act or when he was being straight with you. And the genius of Jim Carrey's performance is we don't know either. And he was pulling cons on people almost up until the point where he passed. And again, I'm sorry for having to spoil it. This is all readily available. Andy Kaufman was only 34 when he died. 34. Goodness gracious. And yes, you can say, what an extraordinary life he lived. It's true. What an amazing series of achievements he garnered at such a young age. Even with being this sort of polarizing personality, the only man to ever get voted off Saturday Night Live, like it was an episode of Survivor. They actually did this. Voted Andy off Saturday Night Live because he was so polarizing. Some people thought he was a riot. Some people thought he was a genius and groundbreaking, and others thought he was just a cruel piece of shit. And there is an HBO comedy special in the mid-90s called 20 Years of Comedy on HBO. It's the first HBO comedy special in 1975. Robert Klein, who my dad went to school with in the Bronx, they discuss Andy Kaufman, the real Andy Kaufman, in this special. And Alan King, you can see, another Great Neck resident, he actually lived at Kings Point, but Alan King was struggling to come to terms with who Andy Kaufman was and his own thoughts on Andy Kaufman. He thought he was brilliant, but he also thought he was cruel, needlessly cruel. Jim Carrey hits all those points. We see Andy Kaufman before he's on, before people are wondering, what's he doing, where he's just trying to earn a living as a song and dance man, trying different things out at comedy clubs. And he mostly bombs, but he has this one weird character, which is just known as Foreign Man, which if you watch Jim Carrey's iteration of Foreign Man and the real Andy Kaufman, can't tell the difference. And he also did an incredible Elvis Presley impersonation. And it was those two things, because most of his act, as one of the characters says, your act is like amateur hour. The Elvis Presley impersonation, many people say Andy Kaufman did the best Elvis ever, that he was the best Elvis impersonator, even though it didn't really look much like Elvis. And this bizarre character of Foreign Man, who we see in the movie as Jim in an early scene, a critical early scene, where his future agent, George Shapiro, played in the movie by Danny DeVito, sees this guy on stage and knows he's seeing something different. He is witnessing greatness, but he's not sure exactly what kind of greatness. What level of greatness? Is this the sort of greatness that's actually catastrophic? Or just fucking terrible, but we think it's great because it's so different? So the two characters, the Elvis Presley impression, which nobody has ever seen before, holy shit, this is incredible. But this bizarre character called Foreign Man, thank you very much. Take my wife, please, take her. The producers of the TV show Taxi, this is what happened in real life, got wind of this and wanted to cast Andy Kaufman as a character based off of Foreign Man. They end up naming the character Latka Gravis, and he became the breakout star and character on the TV show Taxi. And the movie goes into the fact that Andy Kaufman was not satisfied just being Andy Kaufman, where sometimes you were going to get a troll version of him, and other times he was going to deliver his lines and he was going to hit the marks. And you see the surviving members of Taxi to this day discuss their sometime problematic relationships, because Andy Kaufman often didn't show up for rehearsals, and there were issues supposedly between him and Tony Danza. But Tony Danza, of more recent vintage, has said, I was jealous of the guy because he didn't need to practice. He didn't need to rehearse. He'd come in and he was nailing his lines and things like that. So nobody really knows for sure how disruptive. But Andy Kaufman had this separate character called Tony Clifton, who this unbelievably obnoxious, kind of odious, smelly lounge singer who chain smoked. And Danny DeVito joked about Offset while they were making Man on the Moon. He said, Tony Clifton smelled from Limburger cheese, which is not really that great of an aroma. Jim Carrey plays this obnoxious lounge singer, Tony Clifton. You could argue he does it even better than Andy Kaufman did it. But he makes you believe that when he is under the makeup, he's not really Andy. He is this other persona. It's not even just an alter ego. Jim makes you believe he is this awful person, this horrible, disgusting, gross insult, not even insult comic. He's an insult singer, where he insults the audience while he's doing his act, which is terrible. He can't sing, doesn't know the words, but that's part of the con. That's part of the work, to use a wrestling term. So despite there being enormous chunks of the film, particularly in the first half, where Jim, as Andy, and sometimes as Tony, and where we're not really sure, is this part of the act or is this not part of the act? The extended wrestling sequence, as I teased earlier, the real-life production issues where the actual Jerry Lawler wanted to take Jim Carrey and strangle him. He just wanted to beat the shit out of him. There's no reason to dispute Jerry Lawler's recap of that. But there's an entire huge chunk of the movie which turns out to just be a work. And even the people closest to Andy didn't know. They thought it was all real. And then the tagline for the movie was, we thought it was all real, but it was all part of the act. And so the story with the character, the real life Andy Kaufman, but the character that Jim is playing as he plays it is unsympathetic for significant chunks of this movie, where we kind of understand what he's doing, but we don't get why it's important for him to be a troll all the time. Why does he have to fuck with everybody all the time? Why can't he just enjoy success and be nicer to people? We don't know. It's just how he's wired, I guess. But the genius of Big Jim's performance is that he makes us care. We don't really give a shit about Tony Clifton, but we see in his interpretation of Andy Kaufman, even when he is engaging in deliberate antagonism towards the audience, where he's not trying to be funny, he's simply being, as Alan King said about the real Andy Kaufman, he's simply being hateful and cruel, because he can be hateful and cruel, because he now has money and he can do different things and he can make people feel small and feel stupid. The genius of Jim's performance is that even if you don't really identify with him or understand, you kind of see where he's coming from, and you get that at a certain point, he was just a kid who was pretending to be a star and learned how to do characters to entertain more or less himself, but entertain his sister, and presumably like the stories about Billy Crystal, where he used to entertain friends and relatives. We don't get that in the movie. We get that he was essentially entertaining himself and then finally his sister. But there's something in Carrey's performance, even in the moments where we kind of lose the narrative as far as what's wrong with this guy. And the question, what's wrong with this guy, is repeated literally, but then repeated symbolically. And Milos Forman is not afraid to show the sort of nastiness and the darkness that was in Andy Kaufman, knowing that it could turn the audience off, but he wanted to have a kind of warts and all telling of Andy Kaufman's story. And the takeaway is that if you have a master craftsman at the top of their game, as the case of Jim Carrey here, who was coming off Liar Liar, which, not a great movie, but a massive box office hit, and The Truman Show, which was also a massive box office hit, but I would argue a top 10 best films of its decade, which is saying an awful lot. You had a guy working at peak capacity in Jim Carrey. And even as the character is doing stuff that we don't like, he still has that ability to have the audience root for him. Because this is a sort of movie that runs the risk of the audience, when things start to turn bad, saying, good, fuck that guy. And I'm sure there were some people who had that reaction watching the movie, like, this is an awful person. This is not someone we want to root for. The overwhelming percentage of people watching, though, especially if they don't know the real story, will feel the sting and the pain and the hurt that he feels when things start to go wrong. And when somebody who mostly lived a holistic life, who was into transcendental meditation and was very, very charitable with his time and with his money. You don't get that much of it in this movie, some of it. But there were people who turned their back on him that probably shouldn't have. There's almost a little bit of the Goodfellas element where when Henry comes out of prison, not only does everybody sort of turn their back on him, but he keeps thinking he's going to get bumped off. And in the world of this movie, there are a lot of people who shun Andy Kaufman. And when we see the hurt, almost like a child, in Jim's face, it just sells it. The performance is next level because, as I say, it's not one performance. The Tony Clifton character is simply a troll. He's just there to be an asshole to people. And that's that character's shtick. So even as Andy's health declines, Tony is still doing Tony. Presumably, Andy, to make himself try to feel a little bit better, goes into character and puts on the wig and the obnoxious costume and the mustache and the whole thing. But the more the movie goes forth, the more we get a sense of how Andy Kaufman may have been like. And it is unfortunate that it took the tragic turn of somebody who was a healthful person, who tried to exercise and meditate and move and eat a macrobiotic diet before that was fashionable, going to these sort of trendy restaurants, but actually because he wanted to eat the healthier foods and not the McDonald's or diner food that was certainly in vogue. It's always in vogue, but it was especially in vogue during that particular era. But as things go wrong, as his health declines, it's almost impossible not to root for a miracle and not to root for this guy who really was an underdog, wasn't necessarily the best looking person, wasn't naturally the funniest, but when you took it all together, he was an enormous talent. And Jim Carrey, of course, is an enormous talent. I would argue way more than Andy Kaufman, because Andy Kaufman was never going to be an actor on the level of Jim Carrey. The ability to play the kinds of roles, whether to go from Ace Ventura to Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, or some of his other kind of underrated dramatic performances in movies like The Majestic. We see the hurt in his eyes. We see the fear. And there's even one moment which is, and this was debated at the time, where he says to his girlfriend at the time, the real woman's name was Lynn Margulies, but it was actually played by Kurt Cobain's widow. Many people actually think that she bumped him off. And so she had been nominated for Oscar for People versus Larry Flint. And so Courtney Love is a polarizing figure because of that. And she was in People versus Larry Flint, and she's great. And they don't give her that much to do in this movie. Unfortunately, her opening scene is great on the Merv Griffin show, and that's fun. But she doesn't have that much to do, except there's one moment where Jim Carrey, as Andy Kaufman, says to her, "You don't know the real me." And she says, "There isn't a real you." And he says, "Oh yeah, I forgot." And that scene was criticized at the time because, well, they're not even going to give us something. They're not even going to try to explain this guy. No, because he was unexplainable. That was kind of the point. He could not be defined. He was not, oh, he was just a really nice guy. He was just a trollish piece of shit. He was unique. He was a unicorn. There was nobody like Andy Kaufman. And I hate to even summon his name, but the closest approximation to Andy Kaufman is somebody like a Kanye West. Enormously talented, but somebody who you're not really sure, is he really just deliberately trolling, or does he really think this way? And people were asking questions of Andy Kaufman. Is this really how he is, or is it all a fucking act? Like, what's the story with this guy? What's wrong with this guy? Is he crazy? There's no way Andy Kaufman was crazy. So as his health continues to decline, he has a moment, and this is something that was out of order, that they did for dramatic purposes. And I think it works incredibly well. And we see Jim just deliver massively in this sequence where he's tired. He's tired now of pissing people off. He's almost coming to terms with the fact that he's not going to live for much longer. So he decides he wants to play Carnegie Hall, which was his original goal as a performance artist. I want to play Carnegie Hall, the Rockettes, and Santa Claus. So in real life, the Carnegie Hall concert, which at the time was criticized in some quarters, but in other quarters was praised hugely as something entirely different, takes place late in the film. And you see some of the still edgy humor, like, I don't think that this is appropriate. He didn't give a fuck. But when the Carnegie Hall concert in the movie works exactly the way that Jim, as Andy, envisioned it would, where he wanted actually not to fuck with, he wanted the audience to love him, to enjoy what he was doing, even though there are these moments of audience alienation, even within the context of that show. And his master plan, when the show was over, he had set up at a nearby high school to Carnegie Hall. There were buses outside, and he told the entire audience that if they'd like the night to continue, get on the buses, and we're going to go have milk and cookies nearby. And that's exactly what he did. And in real life, he actually continued the show while they were all enjoying their milk and cookies. He did more humor. And the look on Jim Carrey's face at the end of that scene is so good. It is such brilliant film acting. He's not really laughing. He's not really crying. He's somewhere in the middle. And it's almost like all of the crap that he pulled, he's redeeming the character with this one glance that he was just somebody that really deep down wanted people to like him. All that other stuff was just a cover. Maybe he didn't want to seem vulnerable, but he wanted people to embrace him. And the movie ends with, it's one of the best endings I've ever seen to a film. It might be in my top 5. And the ending is so good that I, as crazy as it is, rank Man on the Moon above Amadeus. That is how good the ending of this movie is for me. So, as I say, Andy Kaufman unfortunately passed, 1984. The movie ends with Tony Clifton, Andy Kaufman's alter ego, doing a set at the Comedy Store, which was where Jim Carrey, the real Andy Kaufman, but Jim Carrey's character in the world of the movie was originally discovered by George Shapiro, Danny DeVito as George Shapiro. So Tony Clifton is doing a set, and throughout the movie, and don't have time to go into everything, unfortunately, Paul Giamatti, in another one of his incredible performances, plays Bob Zmuda, who was the real Andy Kaufman's writer, best friend, and sidekick. And it's another of those unbelievable Paul Giamatti performances from that part of his career. You know, The Truman Show in a much lesser role, Donnie Brasco, forget about it. We see in the movie that Paul Giamatti as Bob Zmuda can also play Tony Clifton. They pull a real scam which fucked people up in real life in the 70s because it didn't make any sense. Well, wait a minute, how the hell did they do this? So we know that Bob Zmuda can play Tony Clifton. So Andy Kaufman has passed. He's a year gone. And here we are at the Comedy Store, and Tony Clifton is on stage. And the assumption is that this is Paul Giamatti, Bob Zmuda, in the Tony Clifton costume with the makeup and disguising his voice and doing all that. And now we know that it's Jim Carrey on stage. We can tell that it's him because just the look. It's not the look that the character of Clifton had when Paul Giamatti was the one under the prosthetics and the makeup. But what the movie does that's so extraordinary is as he's not really singing, he's attempting to sing I Will Survive, you know, the famous Gloria Gaynor Hear Me Roar anthem. We pan in the audience to Paul Giamatti, standing there crying. And we know that the real Andy Kaufman is gone. He didn't fake his own death. He's not going to show up in 2024, here I am. Be great, he'd be 75, but he passed. But in the world of the movie successfully argues Andy Kaufman lives. Andy Kaufman lives on, literally in the movie, but he lives on in the spirit of all who were closest to him. And Jim's performance was so profound throughout that many people, from Danny DeVito to Lynn Margulies to the real Bob Zmuda on down, they claim that during the time the movie was filming, they all said, it was nice having Andy back. That is how much Jim gave to this part. It felt like he was him. Looked like Jim Carrey when he wasn't in makeup, but there are things that he learned about us. It felt like Andy was talking to us from beyond the grave. It is an impression, an almost literal impersonation. It's one of the greatest film performances I've ever seen. The entire 2-hour plus running time you never feel like that's Jim Carrey doing Jim Carrey. He is Andy Kaufman. He is Tony Clifton. He's just a kid from Great Neck. Wanted people to like him. Jim Carrey as Andy Kaufman on Andy Kaufman, sometimes off. Tony Clifton in Milos Forman's 1999 biopic, Man on the Moon, the 8th entry in our continuing series of the most underrated film performances. And that brings to a close episode 127 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all once again so much for joining me here on this Friday in New York. And if you caught this episode on the YouTube channel, enjoyed it, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, and turn on those notifications. Or if you catch up with episode 127 on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 128 real soon. Until then, thank you very much. Peace.